Right. To everyone that has come so far, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Daniel Erasmus. I work for IO Associates as a QA specialist recruiter. With me today, as usual, is Callum Akehurst-Ryan, the software tester lead for Improbable Games in London.
Hey everyone. As I said, I'm a software tester at Improbable. I've got 13 or so years of experience focusing around building up Agile teams and integrating exploratory testing into those teams. I'm also a kick-off dungeon master in my spare time as well.
Great stuff. Right. So today we're going to be talking about exploratory testing. Cal, can you take us through to that slide? Callum, what is exploratory testing? Because a lot of people think it's just clicking around and playing around with software.
Yeah, no, that's a good starting point. So obviously we want to talk about how we're going to embed exploratory testing into our teams, especially when we're new. But it's good to just get a baseline understanding on what exploratory testing is and isn't. So exploratory testing at its core is a technique in testing that we use to find information. It allows us to be collaborative with our teams. It's also very structured and provides relevant and useful information much more quickly than if we're doing waterfall or scripted tests. It lets us jump into things and start using it to drive out information. What it's not is focusing on what we already know. So we're trying to explore for new information. It's also not unstructured. People think it's quite chaotic and just clicking around and running around madly trying to get information. But it can be quite structured. You can report for it. You can plan for it. It's definitely not test versus dev because it's very collaborative. And also it's not dependent on a finished product, which is really useful because if we can start pushing our testing into earlier and earlier, so like headless testing where we don't have a UI, then we can start finding out quality information and providing those narratives much earlier. So like I've said, exploratory testing is really just interacting with a product or a system with the express intention of sharing information about it. So if you've ever, I think I've got a slide for this. Yeah, if you've ever got a new phone or a game or an application, and rather than sitting there reading the manual to find out what it should do, if you just actually start using it, then you've effectively done exploratory testing. That's what we're doing. We're sort of trying to interact with something to get information about it, see how it works, so that we can share that with people. It's really useful in different types of teams, especially teams where maybe we don't have requirements yet, or the requirements are really badly documented. If we talk about like here, if our knowledge level about how something's going to work, if we say over here on the left, it's the least risky, we explicitly know about it. And over here on the right, we don't have any idea about how it's going to work. Exploratory testing can give us information as we start to use things to say, we didn't know how it was going to work. We started using it. We're finding information. Now we know how it's going to work. And then when we know how something works, we can focus on that sort of scripted testing. Did it do this? Yes. Did it do this? Yes, kind of thing. And again, I talked about being able to push our testing much earlier as well, using exploratory testing. Just to give you a view here, existing testing models that use scripted testing or test scenarios and test scripts usually focus around here. Like we get from into development, maybe we write unit tests or design code and we can scripted test here, or we can get into a test environment and test there, or maybe release and beyond release. When we talk about exploratory testing, we can push all of our testing much earlier because we can start finding out information and getting embedded in with a whole team much more quickly. So if you're working at a company who is starting to move towards Agile, thinking about exploratory testing, making your testing approach more lightweight because you're not having to write loads of scripted steps, means you can have time to push into saying, if we're looking at an idea for a new feature? How do we test that design to make sure it's useful? How do we make sure that our artifacts, so any design documentation, requirements, or tickets in something like Jira, are actually useful for the team? How can we test our planning that takes place to make sure that we're able to build what we need to build? And again, when we get into like implementation, how we can test the designs of things as well. That's a really high level, very quick run through of exploratory testing, just to give you sort of a view on what that means, so that we're all on the same page before we talk about how, going further with it. I know that was like really quick and high level because I've done lots of talks before, and last time we did a talk about like the details of exploratory testing. But if there's any questions that anyone has, just so that we're all on the same page to begin with, fire them off in the chat and we'll answer them. Otherwise, we'll just assume that everyone's like, yeah, we know what this is. Cool. Awesome. So one of the big questions that we canvassed when we were starting to think about this topic was going, okay, exploratory testing, it's a thing where I can find information and it's a bit easier to integrate into an Agile team. But how do I go about implementing it? What does it mean? And what we really want from this is to be able to start using missions and charters in place of scenarios and scripts. A charter, or a test mission, if you want to sound more fun, is a testing tool. It gives us focus to the exploration that we're going to do. So much like a test scenario that you would normally write, it gives us an aim of what we're going to test or what we're going to explore. But unlike a scenario, it's much more open. So it gives us flexibility. So think of it like a ring fence. You say, I want to look in this kind of area, rather than say, I want to look for this thing, then this thing, then this thing. You just write something a bit broader to say, I want to check out this function using this kind of data. And I've put this picture here, Explore It by Elizabeth Hendrickson. That's like the standard Bible for exploratory testing. So if you get a chance to, it's really good to get that book and to find out more information about this kind of thing. So I talked about what a charter is and how it's specific yet flexible, how it's aligned towards investigating opportunities, and how I also talked about exploratory testing being collaborative and sharing knowledge. Just to go into that a little bit more, our exploratory tests, charters and missions, because you can write something at a much higher level when you're doing exploratory testing. So let's say, for example, I have got a new login feature. Rather than writing scenarios to say, this field exists, I can put these details into these fields. I can put these details into these fields, so I can pass or fail them. I'm able to write something that's specific to say, explore the use of the login with various valid data to discover information about how logins are managed or what valid inputs are allowed. Or even one to say, explore the use of the login field with various invalid data to discover information about what errors are presented to the user. These are really focused. So we're saying, what do we want to test? What do we want to find information about? But they're flexible enough that I can actually do some exploration there. Rather than having to write everything out, I can just cover them all off in that sort of thing. And that's useful because it means my exploratory testing aligns me towards investigating opportunities. I know that probably we've all heard that bugs tend to cluster. So if we're able to explore something, if we're able to look more into the details of it, what we can do is we can start drilling in and debugging things and provide really useful information. If I start to see that numeric numbers won't be allowed in the password field, I can say, do you know what, that's an opportunity. What about special characters? How long are those strings allowed to be? What about the API that's behind the UI? Is there some validation issues there? What exactly the errors coming back from this? Are they coming from the API, or is this just at the browser level? And that gives us like more scope to really flesh out what these issues and bugs are, so that when we talk back to the developer, we don't have to raise like 15 bugs to say, oh, it won't allow me A, it won't allow me B, it won't allow me C. We can say, right, there's a problem with the back end where it's not allowing to parse any characters other than alpha. And that's really key when we talk about our reporting. The reporting of exploratory testing is collaborative and it's focused on knowledge sharing. So rather than bugs or number of things passed or number of things failed, what we're looking at is a type of testing where we gather a lot of information about the quality of the system, and I'm able then to share that to the team, either through debriefing or at a higher level. So I'm able to say things like, okay, I've had a look at the login feature and I found a lot of great stuff about that. The API backend is allowing me to validate alpha numeric, just numeric, special characters. The rules around that are looking great. And I did find an issue where if you stop putting white spaces in, the backend fails with a 500. So I'm giving a lot more context as to the quality of something rather than just turning around and saying, yeah, I ran 15 tests and 7 of them passed. Because that doesn't tell me anything about how good is the feature? Like, what even is the feature if I just give you a pie chart? So that's the main things of why we would use charters. And I've touched upon it, but what a charter is broken down into is this idea of explore something with resources to discover information. And that gives us a scope. What are we going to test? How do we make this testing focused so it's not just randomly click around, try and break it? We're saying, no, I'm interested in knowing about this piece of information. I'm going to look at my tools. That might be data, that might be different techniques. It might be, say, explore the login functionality with the Chrome browser and various valid data inputs or various card inputs or something like that. And it gives us an aim to discover information related to the risk that alphanumeric characters or valid usernames or usernames our customers use won't be accepted by the system. So this means that my testing isn't chaotic. I'm really focused on an area so that I can give relevant and useful information back to my team. So if I was just to give an example, I gave an example, but here's another one. Explore the use of a chair seat with different sizes of a person to discover information related to whether or not the seat may be too narrow. I always use chairs as an example, and then I didn't this time. Sorry about that. When we're doing test missions and running these sorts of test missions, people ask me about test tools quite a lot. So I thought I'd just capture some for you to say all the different types of things that you can do. So if you're doing exploratory testing, there's loads of different tools that you want to take. The little trick is that you have to think about what you're testing, and that will tell you what kinds of tools you want. But generally, heuristics, ways of working, and cheat sheets. There are loads out there if you Google them. If you look up exploratory testing cheat sheets or exploratory testing heuristics, you'll be able to find quite a lot there, and those will guide your testing or give you ideas for what to test. I've seen people use decks of cards that have test ideas on them. So when they're blocked, when they're saying, "Oh, I've got 30 minutes to like explore this area," look at usability. Okay, cool. They'll pull those up. Browser dev tools, like inspecting things and getting behind the UI layer, is really good to look at network traffic, because if you're able to align yourself to the opportunities of looking at what data is being sent and returned, you can gather more information and learn more about the quality of the product. APIs, I always use Postman. Postman's great because not only does it allow you to manually craft a load of calls to your API, it also allows you to automate them. And there's a great load of snippets for automated testing via Postman. It's usually a really great place to start your automation journey. If you're looking at networking as well, between front and back end, you might want to use tools like Fiddler, which allows you to interrogate traffic, but also inject traffic for security reasons. And also things like Clumsy that will simulate bad connection failures, packet loss, and things like that. If you're looking at accessibility, look for tools like Lighthouse, Axe, Wave, or the handy web content accessibility guidelines, because that will guide your testing there. If you're testing progressive web apps, so the installation of websites onto mobile devices, Lighthouse, which is a Chrome browser add-on, is really good. And also GitHub and terminal controls are a really useful thing, because if you're starting to push your testing earlier, you're going to want to be able to pull things from Git and build them, or just be familiar with how to build your own environments. Because if you're waiting for things to be dumped into a test environment all the time, it takes longer. Your feedback takes longer. I also did here note-taking tools. Note-taking is really important in any testing. Usually the reason we write scripts is because we want to be able to pass fail and add screenshots and evidence things. We can do that in exploratory testing. As you're looking around the system and exploring it, you can be making notes. I favor mind maps for that, something like Xmind. MindMap as well is another one that gets attached to Google Drive. Or there are tools like Test Buddy out there that you can use for capturing test information. You can use Excel or Google Sheets. You can capture screenshots or record your screen with a screen recorder. Or at the very least, you can get all that stuff and plonk it into tickets in Jira. You can make QC, Quality Center tickets or scenarios, or you can use something like TestRail as well. The first time I started doing exploratory testing as an approach, it was really important for us that we were still using Quality Center to capture the testing that we were doing, because people wanted to see that we were still testing in the same way. All we did was, instead of writing all of the scripts within them, we would create those top level scenarios and write them in this format to say explore with to discover, and then attach to that any notes that we were taking using one of these formats as well. So you can definitely use existing tools to manage and keep track of your exploratory testing.
While we just for the moment, does anyone have any questions about the tools, or even about heuristics? Because I appreciate that exploratory testing on this level isn't actually that commonly done. Particularly, I found that in the Southwest market. Cal, could you give us an example of a heuristic?
Yeah, so a testing heuristic. A heuristic is a way of working, or just a little aid to memory. There are lots of different ones out there, and usually you just end up finding ones that work for yourself. If I'm looking at data, for example, I think CRUD, C-R-U-D, create, read, update, delete. That's just a little like mnemonic that helps me to remember the types of things I should be looking at. If I'm doing boundary analysis, I think Goldilocks as my heuristic, because then I look for too big, too small, just right. Things like that. You can Google a lot of them, and there are these huge periodic tables of the things. Everyone's got their own ones where they think about how to just make testing, how to make it easier to remember what to test. The thing with exploratory testing is, because you've got this sort of wider net rather than a scenario with scripts, you're coming up with your tests as you do them. You're using the system, you're testing the system as you go. So having these little like aids to memory and cheat sheets makes it a lot easier for you to be productive as you're going through, rather than thinking, oh, what should I look at next? You might go, crud, let's try create something, let's read something, let's update it, let's delete it. Things like that really help.
Excellent. Does anyone have any further questions on any of the exploratory testing tools?
Cool.
If not, it's absolutely fine. Shall we move on to the next section?
Yeah. So one of the big things, how's a tool like Lighthouse fall under exploratory testing? That's a good question. So Lighthouse effectively is a tool that allows you to run a lot of tests in the browser to basically look at things like accessibility, performance, things like that, like time to read and so on. If I were looking at progressive web apps and I had some exploratory testing to say along the lines of, okay, explore the loading of the home page with the Lighthouse tool to discover information about the time to read under different network conditions. I can use that tool to basically give me information and data while I'm exploring it. So I might change up the network speed, use Lighthouse under those conditions, and find information out about it. So I might say in 3G, the time to first paint, terrible. Whereas in 4G, it's acceptable. In 5G, it's optimized. So it's about finding that information. So I can use those tools. Also, let's say if I was doing accessibility, I might say, okay, explore the accessibility of the homepage with various accessibility tools such as Axe, Wave, and Alley to discover information related to the low-hanging fruits issues that will come out of those tools. So rather than it just gives me that framework to play, and I can add more to it as well, or I can add to it. Hopefully, Hamza, that helps to explain that. That's efficient. You can use a conference page in doing exploratory testing. Do you have an example of what you were thinking with relation to that? Because I would say if I was taking notes and I wanted to capture them in a place where everybody could see them, or if I wanted to report back on what I was looking at, I could create a conference page or a wiki page, definitely. Sometimes you could use a Google Drive to dump all your test notes in, but a conference page would do perfectly fine as well. Is that what you were thinking of? Cool. Yes. So definitely, that's a good way of doing it. Definitely, I've done that a lot in the past as well. You can also use Confluence to document things like your approach for how you're going to do things, or ways that you're going to collaborate with the rest of your team as well, just so that it's all nicely documented and clear, and everyone can see that and edit it. Cool. Any other questions on what we've covered so far, or I can move on? Cool. So one of the big things that comes out of exploratory testing is people tend to get a bit scared because it doesn't seem like it can be planned. And that was one of the questions that came out, especially from test managers. They want to know that this can be planned and we can fit it into time and so on. What we can do initially, this is just a quick mock-up that I threw together that I started to use when introducing exploratory testing into environments where they were quite Agile light. They hadn't used a lot of testing before. The devs and the testers hadn't worked together before. And I basically just threw together Excel sheets where I said, I'm going to come up with my test charters, my exploratory testing, and I'm going to time box them. T-shirt sizes, large, medium, or small. Large ones will be 4 hours. Medium will take me 2 hours to do. Small, an hour. And that time box is, I'm going to look at this test for this amount of time to try and find out everything I can based on that. And after that, done, hard stop. If I need to write more tests after that to discover, because I think, oh, I also need to cover these things, I'll add them in. But other than that, I know how long I'm going to spend on this area. And I put a priority next to them as well. And I made this a very open document that everyone could see. So I could say, if these priorities don't look right, let me know. If something seems like risky or we definitely want to cover that, let's talk about the priority as well. So it gave me like this whole thing where I could say, okay, to cover all of the high priority areas that we've discovered for this project or for this sprint or for whatever, it's going to take, I can take this long to find information about it. So it actually gives me a lot more that I can plan for time-wise, rather than say scenarios that I don't have timings against. So when I was doing this, I threw in all my test ideas based on what I could understand about the system. I knew that I didn't have to run them all. Some would be low priority. I probably want to cover some things, but I just wanted to make sure if I was going to test everything or that I can think of, this is what it looks like. And when I say test everything I can think of, it's important to note that testing is infinite, and especially exploratory testing is infinite. When I want to do my testing, and especially this kind of testing, I want to make sure the information that I'm giving back to my team is useful and they're going to do something with it. As soon as I'm running tests that result in just bugs in a backlog that are never going to be fixed, that's the line. I need to stop testing that because it's not useful to anyone. My test should result in decisions. It should result in either us saying, okay, here's some design decisions that we need to make. We need to fix this, or we need to change this, or we're good with this. Part of it is taking your ego out of the equation as a tester and going, just because I could think of all these different ways to break the system doesn't mean it's ever going to happen. So be realistic about these things. And with your time box, keep them simple. So small, medium, large t-shirt sizes, like I said, and be really strict. Don't start pushing over because otherwise your planning won't work. And as I said, keep your prioritization visible and agree what's useful with the team as well, because that's who you're working with. And then if you've got any new tests that come out of things, or you want to retest something, just add it to the bottom like I have here with a retest. So I might say, do you know what, I need to look at that, redo all the bugs over that, or find more information about it. I'll spend less time on it and it's a lower priority because I've already thought of the big things. Just a point on time boxing. If I'm spending longer on something, I'm going to get more depth of information. So when you're testing and when you're looking around a system, you're always going to start at surface level and just poking around at a happy path. When you focus on something for a longer amount of time, that's when you're going to start to drill into more and more interesting and useful information. So sometimes those larger time blocks of focus time are really useful. So that's what we just talked about there. So again, think to yourself when you're prioritizing these things, is a depth of knowledge important to the team? So should I spend longer in a certain area, or should I get more coverage at a high level? What's the risk looking like with these things? And talk to your team about that as well, because there may be some areas that you just don't need to test and some areas where you need lots of testing. And your team will be the expert in what they're intending to build and the solution that's there. So they should be able to help you. Another way you can do it, that I do it now, is I create mind maps. I pull out all the risks of a new feature. So for a chair here, I broke it down into things: legs, back, cushion, materials, ergonomics. Came up with questions and risks related to that. From there, came up with test ideas and like that. And then started to go, yeah, I looked at that, it looked good. Oh, I looked at that, it looked bad. That's another way you can do it as well. And these numbers here came from prioritization of talking that through with the team as well. Very similar. The only difference here is I haven't added the time boxes. Whatever works for you and however your brain works, mind maps are great, or something like an Excel document there. It just seems a bit less unfamiliar. It seems more familiar to teams. So that's planning the tests and planning exploratory testing in a way that will feel familiar to people. Is there any questions that people have around that? Because I can answer anything around that. Hamza, that's a very specific question related to an insights document tool as opposed to planning for exploratory testing. I don't have any thoughts on it at this point, and it wasn't the purpose of this thing. It's not something I know about. So Lighthouse was an example, but yeah, you can use anything. Any questions on planning and how you'd want to add them into your teams? Guessing not. I'll move on. So the other side of this, as well as planning, which is quite important to people, is the reporting that comes out of it. As testers and in test functions especially, there's this view of we must be reporting all the time on things. So in exploratory testing, the ways that we report is using our test sheet. So the document that I showed to you, we could add test notes to that. We could use our confidence page to add test notes to. We can talk about quality. We can report to the team in bugs. We can capture a load of bugs on something. That'll give us an idea about the quality of it. We can talk in stand-ups. Usually I've seen teams where they're very new to Agile. They focus very much on what they're doing. So they'll come in and say, yeah, yesterday I got up and I made a cup of tea and then I did some testing and then I had lunch and then I did a bit more testing and I went home. They talked about what they were doing. In stand-ups, what you can be doing instead is you can focus on the tickets that you're looking at. So you can say, yesterday I focused on the front end ticket. That's looking really good. I was looking at the login function there. The inputs are looking really good. I traveled that back to the back end. That's looking really good as well. I've got some questions that I have around this as well. So especially around how we're going to validate data. So that gives a bit more of a report back to the team. And you can use debriefing as well, which is a short conversation related to the quality of something between a tester and a developer. I've just noticed a question there, which I'm just going to jump back to. So sorry. About planning and how exploratory testing could be fixed into a sprint. Yes, Josh. Exploratory testing can be fixed into a sprint really easily. Let me just pop my way back a bit just to show you something. So in a sprint, we pick up new work, and our new work will go usually from an idea through to an artifact. So we'll end up with a Jira ticket or some high level user story, maybe. We'll plan it at the beginning of a sprint. We will design it. So as part of coding or as part of a UI exercise, we'll design what we want this thing to do. We'll then develop it through coming up with unit tests, writing code, designing code, doing code reviews. Sometimes we'll want to dump it into a test environment for further testing. We'll want to release it, and then it will go beyond release at the end of the sprint. We can use exploratory testing within our sprint at all of those points. But when it comes to charters specifically, so these kinds of charters here, we can definitely fix them into a sprint in the same way that we would for scenarios as well. What we would say is we'd say for every ticket that comes along, we'd want to have some time put aside for risks and testing that we would do. We can time box that whole thing to say, this is quite big. So small, medium, large, this is a big feature. We want 2 days of testing on that. And we'll look at different exploratory testing within that. And that's you've got to deliver it within, T- 2 days of the end of the sprint. So we can do all things like that as well. I've worked in a lot of places that have used different ways of doing this with story points where they've tried to buffer things to say testing should be included. I've worked at a lot of places that have said it's the developer's job once they pick up a ticket to ensure that it has been tested and it can move to done at the end of the sprint. Otherwise, it gets pulled into the next sprint, and the first thing that happens is we have to work on all the debt from the last sprint. Although they're responsible when they pick up something into moving it to done, they usually ask a tester to help them come up with the tests for that. So that's where we would use that exploratory testing. But we can definitely fix it into a sprint. If something's not done and finished because we haven't tested it or so on, then it just moves into the next sprint as well. But the key thing with exploratory testing and testing within an agile environment as well, we're here to provide support to the team. We're here to provide information as to the quality of something. We're not here to say, you're not allowed to move that to done. If the team wants to move something to done and they don't want exploratory testing over it, we can raise the risk and say, that could be pretty risky. We haven't thought about this. Have we thought about edge cases? We've thought about error conditions. They might say, yeah, happy with it. Written a load of automated tests. It's a good one. And we'll say, yeah, cool. I'll look over here. So we're not here to be gatekeepers at all. We're here to support the team when we're doing exploratory testing. And that's a bit of a mindset shift for people as well, because especially if you're in the banking industry and you've definitely got to do certain things or you've got to hit certain audit points, that's a bit of a change for people. So that kind of waffle answer your question there, Josh, or have you got any follow-ups? Cool. What proportion of a tester's time, so just a question from Matt here. What proportion of a tester's time should be spent exploratory testing versus other types of testing? So that's a good question. And when we talk about other types of testing, do you mean scripted testing or automated testing? It really does depend, unfortunately, Matt, on the work that we've got here. You can definitely say we need to ensure that we have all these types of testing to cover off something to be done. So we need to know information about it, and then we need to add a load of automation on it as well. That might influence how we do this kind of testing or what time we apportion to this type of testing. But ideally, I would say a tester's time should hopefully be mostly testing and mostly exploratory testing to find information about the new work that's being done, and as little time as possible on, say, the scripted testing or automation. I've seen teams that have gone 20% automation, 80% exploratory testing. I've seen teams where you've got a dedicated exploratory tester and then you separate out to an SDIT, and that focuses on the just the coding for the team to get the automated test in place, and the exploratory tester feeds into the SDIT. It's quite it's a very broad topic, Matt, and it might be something to sort of drill into sort of wider at a later date. Have you got any specific thoughts that you wanted to sort of like pass over or discuss? Yeah, so really the main value that you're going to get out of your testers is the testing side of things, and that means exploration to find out new information about work in flight. So try and keep that to the big bit of the work, the stuff that's useful to the team. Automation or running manual test packs for regression purposes, try to keep that as minimal as possible. You definitely need to do it to make sure you've got the space to know that your system isn't breaking when you're making changes, but maybe keep it to 20% or try to keep it as less as possible, because you need that time to be focusing. And luckily in sprints, at the beginning of them, you've got that bit of time where people are coming up with what they're going to build and develop, and there's nothing to actually explore at that point. That's the time where it's perfect for adding in that regression from maybe the last sprint as well. As for asked if you can cover non-functional tests in exploratory testing, 100% yes, you can. Accessibility, performance, security, all those things you can do. You say, I want to explore the login endpoint with different security vulnerabilities and injection attacks to discover information about how secure things are. And then you just get a tool that allows you to start injecting things into the network traffic. Really exciting stuff. I love doing non-functional testing over my using exploratory techniques. In fact, I think non-functional testing traditionally has been a lot more exploratory than functional testing, even in the past as well, because these were things that you had to sort of think about a bit more than plan for. Cool. So just going back to where we were at reporting. Unless anyone's got any more questions on the planning side of things. Oh, yeah. Julian saying, can exposure testing still add values when requirements are very explicit when development cycles are started? You can create test scripts on the requirements as soon as development begins. Yeah. If you've got really explicit requirements for something, what you can do, I'm going to go back to this, is you can create charters or checks for those for the requirements that are there, but you need to explore to find out, what if the requirements have missed something? What if they've just done the happy path of things? I've had very explicit requirements at the beginning of a development cycle, but they've only been happy path. And the first thing I did when I did exploratory testing is I said, okay, explore the use of these fields with invalid data types to discover information about what happens. And the API completely fell apart through 500s. The UI didn't like it because the requirements had only focused on the happy path. So that's definitely something to take into account. You can always explore to find information out, and that can then go back to the design team. A question that we can ask as well: do we need very explicit requirements, especially if we're moving to a more agile environment? Because if we're getting more agile, we want to spend time doing and less time with the sort of planning for it. We want to use our time productively. So we can focus on writing acceptance criteria, which are, again, it's like higher level of requirement to say, the user needs to be able to do this. We don't say how, but they need to be able to do this. And then we use the exploration to find information out about that as well. Does that hopefully answer your question, Julian? Cool. Awesome. Right. So reporting. Should we be... What do you mean by that, Hamza, in terms of severity? Like when you're coming up with... Because I would say a bug sometimes has a severity and as well as a priority. But when we're coming up with our tests, we just want to prioritize them to know what we want to run first. So what do you mean by that? Give me a sec to type. Oh. Right, while he's typing, focus on reporting. So as I was saying before, so in our reporting of exploratory testing, what we want to do is when we're talking to the team, we want to focus on providing information about quality. So we're less about metrics and numbers at this point. We're not saying I've run 15 tests, 33% of them passed. Doesn't mean anything. We want to provide information back to the team. I looked at this endpoint. I put in valid and invalid data. The error messages coming back all looked good. The positive cases all created 201s. That all looked brilliant. Loved it. No issues were found. So it's pretty good to go. Something like that's going to be useful to the team. We can do that, via the test sheets that we create. So, or Confluence by saying, this is what we'd looked at. This is how good it was. We can, in the specific bugs we raise for when it comes to issues, talk in stand-ups, like I said, and also run those debriefs. So once we've completed like a section of testing, talk back to the developer to give them that information and make an agreement on what needs fixing. And then when we're talking to stakeholders, which is again is important for test managers, that test sheet that I had where it said test, amount of time, priority, we can say the progress of it as well to say, yep, done that, done that, done that, done that. And we can say, yep, we've spent 15 hours looking at this. Here are the number of bugs that came out as well. Or if we're in Jira, we can say, here's the ticket progress. Here's how many tickets are currently in test. Here are how many are done. Here's how many coming up. So we've got like a view of our cadence as well. And as always, demos. As testers, we can always be involved in the demos as well to help showcase the quality of products that have been developed in the sprint as well. So I talked about test sheets. Here's what I've used in the past. So I had my test charter and my time box and my priority. So priority there being for working out which things I was going to run before anything else. I put in a status to say whether issues were found or if it looks good to go. Put in a number of issues, maybe with a link to them in Jira or a link to the test notes that I had. And that way I was able to say, these are the areas that are problematic that we need to keep working on. These are the areas that look good. Here's how much time I've spent on testing. So I've spent 6 hours on testing and I've got 1 hour left to go in this sprint. Ooh, Sebastian, what's your experience with getting other stakeholders or team members involved in exploratory testing sessions?
Good question.
Really good question. So I'm going to come on to other team members, but just to quickly go into it now, I have used sheets like this that's on the screen at the moment to get developers and other team members to help with testing. Initially, we would have code freeze where we wanted to do regression testing or we wanted to do bug bashes. And using something like this and helping them to explore or giving them structure for exploration, I got developers working to do the same kind of testing that I would do. Sometimes I paired with them, I sat with them and guided them through some of the initial sessions for an hour or two, just to say, here's the kind of things I look for, have a go yourself. And I usually found that people were really interested in doing this kind of testing themselves. So yeah, you can get any stakeholders or team members definitely involved in this kind of testing. If you create the scenarios so that they're meaningful, give them a bit of an overview of the area, maybe run through the happy path with them initially so they know what they're looking at. You can say, right, here's an hour, find out some information about me, or run a bug bash, find out any issues you've got, whack them onto this document here. It's like user acceptance testing, if you've ever done that. Get all the information that you find onto this document, and then we'll use that to debrief at the end. And you usually find people have a big respect for the type of testing you do as a result of that. So yeah, really good question, Sebastian. So that's just what I talked about there. And yeah, outstanding charters here will show as what's left to be tested. So I can say, this is how much testing I've got left to look at in this area. It will take me an hour. If we don't do it because it's a low priority, it's not the end of the world. I talked about debriefing. So when you're talking to your team, the best way to provide information is a debrief. And that's a quick discussion between the tester and somebody who's worked on that item to share the information that's been found. Usually that takes the form of talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly, as well as, but it's a collaboration. So I usually come into, once I've done some testing, I usually ask the developer if I can sit with them for 5 minutes and share the information that I found. I go through what I've covered. So using my test notes from this, I'll say, here are all the different things that I've looked at. Is there anything that you thought from your development of it could also be included? I say, here's everything that looked good. This is all working. So that's brilliant. Thank you so much. Here are the things that I found where I didn't think they were working as expected. And from there, I would enter into a conversation with the developer because they're going to be the expert in what they'd intended to build. I can bring in some business knowledge, and then we can say, do we think this needs fixing now? Is this something to add to the backlog? What do we need to do? And then if I've got any questions, or I'll let them collaborate with me to say, maybe think about these test ideas as well. So it's just, that's just another way. So as well as having these kind of sheets, which are a bit more sort of like send them out to your stakeholders, having more intimate like discussion with your developers and your team members is going to be useful for sharing information as well. Before I move on, any questions on reporting of testing in these sorts of environments? I will say as well that this kind of debrief, this discussion here, you can also do to your wider stakeholders as well, like your product owners, in the form of a demo at the end of the sprint as well. If you own that, you can say, here's what we've looked at. Our testing showed this was good and this was good and this had a bit of an issue. Is that something that we care about right now? We decided not, but if it is, we can add it to the backlog. Cool, no questions with that yet. This is something that Sebastian was asking about, integrating into the team directly. So just talk about a bit of this stuff as well. So the main thing when you're doing testing and when you want to build up your reputation in a new team, especially if you're moving to Agile from Waterfall, is that you have to become a trusted advisor. Testers are usually seen as those people that bring problems, those people that cause a lot of work. They're not technical, they just raise bugs, they're not on the same page as us. We need to show the team that we're on the same side as them and that we are technical and that we can provide useful information to them, because that's going to really help that integration. That's going to really help with that collaboration between people. So that looks different in different types of teams. If you're at a low Agile maturity, what you might want to do is you might want to still run sessions instead of scripts. So that's the only thing you're doing, really. You're using your existing test tools. Maybe you'll contribute a little bit to stand-ups, and you'll basically switch away from writing scripts and just write that high-level exploration to get started. Capture all those in Quality Center or Test Rail, but just start practicing, exploring, finding information, and then turning anything you find into bugs. When you get to a more medium level of agile maturity, you can start collaborating a bit more. So start to share test info, in not just the bugs. So say what's good about the system or what questions you had about the system. Start to socialize the idea of debriefing. So having those discussions with developers so that you can actually start sharing that information directly, so that you don't have to just communicate via Jira or bugs. You can communicate face to face. When you can start to push your testing to earlier before development by capturing risks and test ideas on design tickets. I call them artifacts, Jira tickets, whatever requirements to inform on development. That might be looking at the requirements and pushing back to say, we haven't thought about this edge case, or we haven't thought about this error handling that needs to be there. And also we can start to support unit testing and debugging. I've done this a lot quite early on. I pair with the developer to say, talk me through the unit tests that you've put in place here. Let's look at coverage. Or we haven't thought about these negative cases. Let's add some stuff for that. Or here's a bug. I can help you debug it. I can run it through with you. Let's put some breakpoints in the code and run through it together. That will really help to be that trusted advisor, because you're helping them to solve the problems. You're not just giving them problems and running away. You're solving them. And when you're at a high level of agile maturity, when you've gone fully agile, start running 3 Amigo sessions. Have a tester, a developer, and a business person into creating requirements, into creating user stories, so that then you can think of all these things up front. Pair with the developers to actually develop things. Run TDD, test-driven development sessions, where you write the unit tests to fail, then write code to get the unit test to pass, and then go forward based on that. And at a high level of agile maturity, you can start to coach the team on quality activities. So like Sebastian was saying, getting other stakeholders and team members actually involved in the testing session. So pair with them, sit with your developers and say, we're going to run this testing. Here's how we do it. One of the best moments I had in these situations is a couple of months into a new team where I'd been pairing with developers to do exploratory testing. 2 developers in stand-up decided they were going to work together and pair together to do exploratory testing without a tester present. And they came up with some really good feedback and really good information. So it can work. So yeah, talked about 3 Amigos. So when we're trying to do, when we're trying to integrate into a team, when we get to that high level of maturity, we want to refine what to build. We want to go, here are our acceptance criteria or our requirements. They should be specific, but they should also cover positive, negative, and edge cases. We need to provide useful information for any work in progress. So we should be doing that exploratory testing, pairing with people to find out, to run testing, or pairing with people to debrief and give useful information on any work in progress, just so that we can prove that we're useful to the team. And we should be talking to the developers all the time. We should definitely not be split. There should not be a test dev split. Get involved, talk about things, talk about designs, find out what they're doing, find out how they're debugging things, become more technical and start speaking at that sort of technical level as well, to provide that support and become trusted. And if all else fails, you can do something called charismatic testing. If you find, like I have, quite early on, developers are very skeptical. Again, they're still thinking that you're going to be running up against problems, or you're going to bring them with problems. Do look for the good in something and just provide feedback on that. So run testing specifically to find the good in a feature that someone has worked on, and win people over with kindness. Say, I had a look at this feature. This looked awesome. This was really great. The flow of the data through here, awesome. The way that you've implemented these 201 requests, brilliant. Because that shows that you're not just there to pick holes in things. You're there to provide that level of information that's good as well as bad. So positive reinforcement is something that really works. I've run debrief sessions before where I've gone to a developer and said, ooh, just had a look at this really complex piece of work. Can we talk about it afterwards? They've been like, ooh, yeah, okay. I've been like, look, all this is green, all these positive things. I've had a look at this and this and this and this. It all was working brilliantly. It's awesome. All the contract testing was fine. The performance on it was really quick. Thank you so much. And from then on, that developer was more keen to engage with the type of testing that and the type of information that we were providing them. So it's a really good way to get involved with your developers and build that rapport, because that's the trick to all of this. So yeah, that's the stuff that we were going to talk through based on the questions that came out initially from people. But is there any other questions or areas that people want to talk about?
While we're waiting, I have a question for you, Callum. So with regards to test-driven development, would you say that exploratory testing has a pretty solid place within that as an approach?
It can do, definitely. When I'm looking at test-driven development, I use exploratory testing techniques to, first of all, break down requirements into their component parts, or a design into their component parts. And I'm able then to think about the risks inherent to those component parts. And when I can start to think of risks, I can then start to think about tests that might come for them, and that will then help my TDD. So I explore the idea of what we're going to do rather than the product. So I've shifted away from having something built to the theoretical idea of what I'm going to test that idea, and then use that to drive out the tests, which will then lead to the development in TDD. And yeah, we can definitely share those as far.
I'll send an email around afterwards to all attendees and everyone who registered, and I'll make sure that the recording's included.
Now's a chance to pick my brains, because I've implemented exploratory testing at all sorts of places. So one from Ruben. Can you use exploratory tests for heavily regulated industries where the product needs to be developed against regulated standards? Yes, definitely. So when you've got very specific standards for something, usually those standards will come, will be at least somewhat nebulous. And you need to effectively be able to show all the different ways in which those standards can be met. So you can use exploratory testing to say, let me just use an example of a standard, let's say accessibility. I might want to find different ways to ensure that this page here is readable by different people. And I can explore that rather than write out loads of tests up front. I can just say, right, we need to meet this level of, or this specific guidance, or this regulation. How does it meet that? Does it meet that on these browsers? Does it meet that if I use different operating systems? Does it meet that if I use different screen layouts or different display settings? So I can explore around those to find out the different ways in which they're going to work. In the financial industries, I know that they're heavily regulated as well. And I've used exploratory testing in those industries to say, okay, you've told me that I have to be able to make Swift payments, and they have to basically bounce from here to here within this amount of time. All right. What about boundary analysis? What about if I'm under a bad network condition? What about, there's all these different things. So I can start to think about more test ideas and cover off more to prove that the regulations have been and the standards have been met through exploratory testing. And again, when you've got those regulations, you usually want proof of those sorts of things. So as I'm going through doing this testing, I'm using my test notes. I'm capturing that information. So none of that information is getting lost just because I'm not doing scripts. It just means that I'm not spending a load of time up front writing those scripts. I'm doing them and writing them as I go, so that I'm able to get involved much more quickly and be more useful to the team. Does that help, Ruben? Let me know if there's anything further on that. Cool. Jake, you asked about recommended courses or materials to help junior testers develop their skills. Yes, if you look on my LinkedIn page, there's a lot of videos that I've done about exploratory testing initially. Also, I recommend having a look at this book here. Explore It by Elizabeth Hendrickson, who is awesome. Basically, that's like the Bible for exploratory testing. And more than not, I recommend just getting involved and doing it. Have a look on, say, a website like Test Buddy. They've got a blog where they talk a lot about exploratory testing. And I think they give some examples of sort of like things to look for as well. Or sign up to the Ministry of Test. The Ministry of Test's website has a load of materials about exploratory testing as well. So there's loads of different things. So I'd say Ministry of Test, Elizabeth Hendrickson's book. Have a look at, what else did I say? Oh, Test Buddy's website and their blogs. And also, if you look on my LinkedIn page, I've got links to a lot of talks that I've done about exploratory testing as well. So hopefully that's a good place to get going on something, and then just try it out and see what you can find. Cool. Matt, you mentioned about teams adopting Scrum and testing new features. Could you talk about exploratory testing on old or already live systems? Yeah, definitely. This is something that I've done before as well. So I came into a project where we had a lump of code and we'd had no documentation around it. And we were a new Scrum team, and they just gave us this lump of code and said, here's something, we don't know what it does. We kind of want it to do these things, but we don't know if it does do it. So we had to use exploratory testing to basically run a full regression suite over this product where we didn't know what it was supposed to do. So we started exploring it. We looked at a high level and broke it down into different areas. And we said, okay, there's a login feature, there's a this feature, there's a this feature, there's an admin feature, there's a database. And we started exploring, trying out lots of different experiments to find out and documenting those things, so that then we could go back to the team, the product owner, and say, do you want it to do this? Do you want it to do this? Do you want it to do this? And from that, we were able then to basically backfill in a load of requirements effectively on something. So that's one way that we can exploratory test to be useful in an old system. In another way, if we're doing exploratory testing as a sense of just for regression testing, that's a lot more ineffective than say writing automated tests and checks for something. If we know what the system does do and should be doing, we should have scripted tests for that. And if I just give you, where was it? Where did I do it? Sorry. Did I not have a picture for it? Yes, I did. There it is. So if I know what something should be doing, I explicitly know exactly what the system should be doing. It's a lot better to write scripted tests for it, either automated or by scripts, so that I can tick them off. Because if I've built something and I'm happy with it and it's already in live and no one's complaining about it, I don't need to find out any new information about how it's working, because I already know how it works. So no, I just want to confirm that it's already working. It's useful to do exploratory testing when we're introducing new features or we want to find out something and we don't have any knowledge of how it's going to be working. So when we've got an already live system and we're making changes to it, we can do our exploratory testing there just for the delta. And once we then understand how that works specifically, we can then go back in, we can turn those into scripted tests. And by scripted tests, usually I mean automated tests, because they're the quickest ones to run or easiest to run frequently and to get the right information back. Brilliant, thanks. Cool. Any other questions?
I have one.
Yeah.
So for a lot of people, I mean, I basically speak to testers and test managers every single day. With regards to that, a lot of what I hear is when I bring up things like heuristics, things like test charters, people aren't necessarily familiar with the terminology. But are there sort of any potential heuristics that people might be using without realizing?
Yeah, probably. Very likely. So ones that I was using back in the old days, when I was thinking of boundary analysis is a heuristic, because you're thinking about whether something's outside of something, inside of something, or the other side of something. So that's a heuristic, which you can change into Goldilocks to say, too big, too small, just right. Things like WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get. KISS, keep it simple, stupid. Things like anything like that helps you are different heuristics. Just little things in your mind. You're probably using loads of these sorts of things already without realizing all the things that you're doing. Anytime you have to do something and you have a little thing where you go, oh yeah, I should be looking at that, is usually because of a heuristic. It's just a way of thinking about your tests much more quickly. Yeah, and you don't have to use them. Like some people say, you've definitely got to use these different heuristics. You've definitely got to use these cheat sheets. Use what's useful to you. Use what's you find, helpful or interesting.
Great stuff. Thank you. Right. Do we have any further questions? I think that might be it. Right, Callum, thank you so much for taking the lead on that. You are absolutely wonderful as always. And I want to say thank you to everyone who came, and I will be sending around the recording and obviously a thank you email to all of you that attended. Yeah, we hope you join us next time.
Thanks, everyone.